He wants the overlay off, all of it, every layer. The hazard net, the depth telemetry, the neural threat overlay, the whole stack. Then he will die in the first flooded chamber. Overseer Semral watched the human through the gallery glass for a moment longer before answering the junior assessor. The human was standing very still in the outfitting hall below, hands loose at his sides, looking at the catalog wall the way a person looks at a room they have already decided to leave. "Perhaps he will die," Semral said. "But I would like to see how." The Deepwell Assessment had been running, without a single year's interruption, for 311 of the standard cycles. It was the oldest continuous evaluation the Assembly still administered, and among the 60-odd member species, it carried a specific and heavy prestige, the kind that attached itself to a thing precisely because the thing had refused to become easier over time. Younger evaluations had been softened, streamlined, and reformed into something survivable. The Deepwell had not. It measured a narrow and brutal set of competencies: nerve under total sensory load, judgment when instruments disagreed with instinct, the capacity to keep making correct decisions after the point at which most minds simply stopped. And it measured them by putting a candidate alone into a place that was actively trying to kill them. The place was a moon called Cedrus, and specifically a fissure system on Cedrus that the Institute's founders had named, with no drama at all, the Well. It was a vertical biosphere, a collapsed cave network that ran better than 4 kilometers straight down into the moon's crust, warmed from below by tidal friction, cold and methane thick at the top, and flooded through its lower two-thirds by a rising and falling water table that answered to the pull of the gas giant Cedrus orbited. Twice every local day, the giant hauled that water up through the galleries in a slow, enormous surge, and twice it let it fall. The surge was not gentle. The Institute's own literature described the tidal maximum in language that the Institute rarely used about anything, which was to say plainly and without qualification: a candidate caught in the lower galleries at surge was not recovered. The task was simple to state: a signal beacon. The Institute called it the core. A dense little instrument package, the size of a clenched fist, was seated at the deepest reachable chamber before each assessment cycle. The candidate descended, retrieved the core, and returned it to the surface before the next tidal maximum sealed the lower well. The clock from drop to deadline ran a little under 30 hours. What the candidate carried down was theirs to decide. That was where the catalog came in. The outfitting hall held 340 items, arranged along a curved wall of lit alcoves, and every one of them had been selected, refined, and reselected across 3 centuries by candidates who had gone down into the well, and, in many cases, not come back. There were powered descent rigs and buoyancy exosuits rated for the surge. There were sonar arrays and echo-mapping drones, thermal augments, pressure-corrective implants, neural overlays that painted the invisible hazards of the well directly onto a candidate's vision, gas pockets in false color, load-bearing faults outlined in warning amber, the water table's rise ticking down in the corner of the eye like a countdown. There were medical synthesizers, emergency flotation charges, self-anchoring line launchers, and a whole alcove of augmentations that could be inarguably called cheating in any evaluation with less than 3 centuries of institutional confidence behind it. The record belonged to a Thren structural specialist who had descended 11 cycles earlier with 62 items, a full augment stack, and a survey team's worth of drones, and had come back not only with the core, but with a complete load tolerance map of the upper well that the Institute still used. 62 items. No candidate in the recorded history of the assessment had gone down with fewer than 9. And the candidate who had tried 9 had not returned, and after that the Institute had quietly begun to treat anything under 15 as a failure of judgment rather than a display of it. The human's file, which Overseer Semral had read 3 times because something in it kept declining to resolve, gave his name as Jonah Rourke. Age, by the human reckoning, 34. Origin, a frontier mining colony, on a moon at the cold edge of a system the Assembly barely bothered to survey. Occupation, listed in the human's own words and left untranslated in the file because the translator had flagged it as culturally specific. Rockburst rescue. Formal assessment training, none. Secondary education, incomplete. Prior evaluations, none. He had applied through the Open Frontier Channel, which the Institute maintained mostly as a matter of principle, and which produced, in a typical century, perhaps 2 applicants worth interviewing. He had funded his own passage to Cedrus because the Institute did not cover travel for species it had not expected to apply, and humans had never applied, and so no one had ever thought to write the line into the budget. Rourke had spent the mandatory environmental briefing the way the recorded footage showed most frontier candidates spending it. Leaning back, arms folded, listening without taking a single note. The briefing officer, a careful Osset who had delivered the same warning 800 times, had reached the section on the tidal surge and paused as she always did to let the gravity of it settle. Rourke had asked one question. He had asked how the water knew when to come up. The officer had explained the tidal mechanics. Rourke had nodded, once, and said that was fine then, and had not asked anything else. The officer had noted in her log that the candidate appeared to have misunderstood the danger. Semrall, reviewing it later, was no longer certain that was the correct reading. In the outfitting hall, Jonah Rourke finished looking at the catalog wall. He had walked its length exactly once, unhurried, hands behind his back, the way a man walks a hardware aisle, for something he already owns a better version of at home. He stopped at none of the powered rigs. He stopped at none of the augments. He returned to the small, unglamorous alcove near the entrance where the Institute kept the items no serious candidate selected. The manual gear, the redundancy stock, the things that had been on the wall for 300 years, mostly because no one had made the decision to remove them. He took a coil of static line, 40 meters, unpowered, the kind that did not launch or self-anchor or do anything at all except be strong. He took a single hand tool, a stubby pry bar with a hooked end, the sort of thing the Institute stocked for freeing jammed hatches, and had never once logged as a primary selection. And he took, from the equipment he had arrived in and been permitted to keep, his own harness, a battered rescue rig, human-made, worn pale at the buckles, that the intake technician had scanned, failed to categorize, and passed through with a note reading personal equipment non-standard, presumed sentimental. Then he pressed his hand to the selection register and asked the attending assessor to shut the overlay off. The assessor, a young Olin named Ethu, whose entire experience of the assessment consisted of 11 cycles of watching candidates request more not less, asked him to repeat the request. Rourke repeated it. All of it, he said. The hazard net, the telemetry, the threat overlay. He did not want it. He said it politely and without any particular emphasis, the way a person declines a second helping of food they have decided they are done with. Ethu escalated the request to the gallery, which was how Overseer Semrall came to be standing at the glass, watching a human decline the single augment that the Institute considered so fundamental it was not, strictly speaking, optional. The overlay that kept a candidate alive by showing them the death they could not otherwise see coming. "Turn it off," Semrall said. The junior assessor beside him made the small subvocal sound the Olin made when they wished to object and knew they could not. "Overseer, he is going down blind, into the well, without the net." "He is going down without our net," Semrall corrected. "Whether he is going down blind is a question I would prefer to answer with data rather than assumption." Log the selection. 2 items and personal equipment. Overlay declined. The register updated. Selection complete. 2 of 340 items chosen. The outfitting hall, which even at rest carried the low institutional hum of a place that took itself seriously, went quiet in the specific way large rooms go quiet when a number of trained observers have all, at the same moment, revised their estimate of what is about to happen and found they cannot agree on the new figure. Jonah Rourke coiled the line over his shoulder, clipped the pry bar to his harness, and walked toward the drop. The upper well, in the first 100 meters below the surface seal, was cold enough that the human's breath fogged and beaded on the collar of his rescue rig, and dark in a way that the Institute's records were careful to describe as absolute. There was bioluminescence deeper down. The well's lower galleries were famous for it, the water carrying a drifting population of things that lit themselves. But the upper reaches held nothing that made its own light, and a candidate who had declined the overlay had also, by definition, declined the overlay's illumination. Rourke had brought no light. This was noted in the gallery with some concern. What he did instead in the first 40 minutes of the descent was stop. He stopped on the first broad ledge below the seal, sat down with his back against the rock, and did nothing that any of the observing assessors could identify as productive. He was not resting. His biometrics, still readable through the harness, showed him alert. He simply sat in the dark, with his hand flat against the stone, for the better part of an hour, and let his eyes and his ears, and the assessors would only understand this later, the skin of his palm adjust to a place that gave almost nothing away. When he stood, he moved differently. He moved like a man who could see, though there was nothing for him to see by, and the monitoring team spent some time arguing about whether the human had residual light amplification they had failed to scan for before the senior biologist pointed out that he did not need light. He was reading the ledge with his feet and the wall with the back of one gloved hand, and the tool clipped to his harness, tapped lightly against the rock every few meters, was coming back to him as sound. The well was answering him. He was, in the plainest possible terms, listening to the shape of the dark. At a depth of roughly 180 meters, at the second hour, he reached the first true hazard. A chamber the Institute's charts marked as a gas trap, a bowl of dead air where a candidate's own exhalations pooled, and the oxygen thinned without warning. The overlay would have painted it in false color, a wash of amber across the low ground, and every augmented candidate in 300 years had walked the marked high route around its rim. Rourke, with no overlay, did not walk the rim. He knelt at the chamber's edge, and he took the pry bar and struck it once against the stone, hard, and he listened to how the sound died. In open air, a struck note rings and travels. In a bowl of heavy dead gas it does not. It flattens, it is swallowed, it comes back wrong. He heard the note die wrong at the low ground, and he read the trap off the sound of it as cleanly as the overlay would have painted it, and he took the high route around the rim, and he did it without any instrument at all telling him the air below him would have put him to sleep and never woken him. In the gallery, the junior assessor Ethu stopped voicing objections and began instead taking careful notes. The first predator found him at the 6th hour, at a depth of a little over 400 meters, where the dry upper well gave way to the first standing water, and the dark began to hold the drifting cold light of things that lived in it. The Institute's biologists knew the species well. They called it a silt drifter, and it was, in the plainest terms, a hunter that had evolved in 300 meters of lightless flooded rock, and had solved the problem of finding prey in the dark by learning to feel for the one thing that had reliably announced its prey for the last 3 centuries. The electromagnetic signature of active technology. Every powered rig, every augment stack, every overlay running behind a candidate's eyes threw off a faint structured field. The silt drifters had learned it. They did not hunt the well's native life, which ran cold and dark and quiet. They hunted the loud, warm, humming things that came down from the surface, and they hunted them well enough that the Institute counted silt drifter encounters as one of the assessment's 3 leading causes of candidate loss. The standard countermeasure, sold hard by the outfitters, was a field-dampening augment, one more powered system, layered over the others to hide the powered systems underneath. Jonah Rourke had no powered systems. He had coil of unpowered line, a steel pry bar, and a human body running at its own quiet temperature, throwing off nothing structured, nothing rhythmic, nothing a silt drifter had spent 300 years learning to find. The recording showed the drifter come up out of the flooded gallery below him. A long, pale, blind thing the length of a transport shuttle, its whole forward surface a sheet of the sensory tissue it hunted with, and the recording showed it pass within 2 meters of the human, and read nothing there worth eating. It quartered the water in front of him, patient and enormous, hunting for the loud technological signature it had been built to find, and finding a cold, quiet primate who had, by the simple act of bringing almost nothing, made himself the one thing in 300 years of the well that the drifter's entire evolutionary specialization could not perceive. Rourke held still against the wall until it drifted off down gallery, and then he went the other way, and he did it without any apparent surprise, and it was at this point that Overseer Semral, in the gallery above, said aloud, to no one in particular, that he understood now why the human had wanted the overlay off. He had not declined the net out of bravado. He had read the same briefing everyone read, and he had understood, where 3 centuries of candidates had not, that in a place where the apex predator hunted technology, the technology meant to keep you safe was the thing painting a target on your back. He had not gone down blind. He had gone down dark, on purpose. And there was a difference, and the difference was the entire point. At the 11th hour, the well tried to kill him with the rock itself. Rotburst was the word in Jonah Rourke's own file, the one the translator had flagged and left alone, and it was the word for what the deep well did when the tidal stress in the crust found a fault under too much load and released it all at once. A section of gallery wall, failing explosively, throwing rocket-killing speed into a space a body happened to be occupying. It was fast, and it gave to an ordinary observer no warning. The overlay would have outlined the load-bearing faults in amber and ticked up a stress figure, and at the critical moment flashed a warning that a well-augmented candidate might have half a second to react to. Rourke, at a depth near 700 meters in a narrow descending gallery the charts marked as structurally poor, stopped walking 4 full minutes before the burst. He stopped, and he put his hand on the wall, and he stayed there, and the monitoring team watching his biometrics spike and hold, could not identify what he had detected because their instruments had not detected anything yet. He backed up. He backed 20 meters up the gallery he had just come down, to a section where the walls narrowed to a pinch too tight for a bad fall of rock to reach, and he wedged himself into it, and he waited, and for 3.5 minutes nothing happened at all, and the junior assessor began, cautiously, to suggest the human had lost his nerve. Then the gallery below him let go. The section he had been standing in 4 minutes earlier disappeared in a fall of rock that the Institute's own sensors, mounted in the walls, registered as a structural event of the 9th severity, the kind that closed galleries for cycles. The pinch he had wedged himself into held. When the dust in the water cleared, he unwedged himself, climbed down through the change gallery, and found. This was the detail the analysis team returned to again and again, that the burst had opened a new passage downward, a fresh fault line running toward the deep well, and that he had been standing near it and reading it, and had known, somehow from the way the loaded rock had been talking to his hand, not only that it was going to fail, but roughly where and roughly when. He had known, the senior biologist said quietly, the way a man knows a thing his whole working life has been about. Rockburst rescue. He had spent his career on some cold mining moon at the edge of nowhere, going into rock that had already burst to pull people out of it, and learning, because his life and other lives depended on learning, to feel the burst coming in time to not be there. The well was not, to Jonah Rourke, an alien horror. The well was Tuesday. The 17th hour brought the water. The lower well, below 1,100 meters, was flooded outright. Long galleries drowned to the ceiling, connected by drowned throats a candidate had to swim, in cold that pulled the heat out of a body fast enough to kill on its own timeline. The exosuit candidates managed this with powered buoyancy and rebreathers and thermal augments. Rourke had none of it. He had a rescue harness, a coil of line, and a human physiology that the Institute's medical staff noted with some alarm was not rated for this. What Rourke did in the flooded galleries was the thing the analysis team would spend the longest trying to categorize, because it did not appear in any candidate record and did not match any technique the Institute taught. He did not fight the cold water. He worked with a rhythm the medical staff eventually recognized, from deep in the human physiological literature, as a deliberate and trained management of the human diving response. Long, slow, breath-held descents through the drowned throats, moving efficiently and never in a hurry, surfacing in the air pockets the well's ceiling held, and that he found not with sonar but by reading the way sound behaved in the flooded rock, the same skill he had used at the gas trap turned upside down. Where the overlay would have mapped the air pockets in advance, Rourke found them by ear, one at a time, in the dark. In water cold enough to stop a heart, and he crossed better than 400 meters of drowned gallery this way without a single powered system, on breath and nerve, and a skill set that had clearly been assembled, over a working lifetime, for exactly this and never once for this. He tied the static line at each drowned throat before he swam it. Anchored to the pry bar, jammed and set in the rock the way the tool had probably been jammed into 10,000 rock faces before, so that the return trip, blind and cold and carrying the core, would have a line to follow. It was the single most experienced thing, the senior biologist said, that anyone in the gallery had ever watched a candidate do. It was the act of a man who did not intend to die on the way back out and had known, before he ever went in, that the way back out was the part that killed you. At the 23rd hour, Jonah Rourke reached the deepest chamber, and found the core, and found the other thing. The core was where the Institute had seated it, resting on a shelf of stone above the deep water, glowing faintly in the drifting cold light of the flooded well. Rourke took it, and clipped it to his harness, and did not immediately turn to leave. He had found on the same shelf the reason the Institute counted the deep well as its highest loss zone. It was equipment, a candidate's equipment, an exosuit, a full augment rack, the powered rig of someone who had come down years before with everything the catalog could sell and had reached this chamber and gone no further. The Institute knew whose it was. The Institute had never recovered the candidate. The gear had sat on the shelf in the deep light, a complete and expensive answer to the well that had not been the correct answer, and Jonah Rourke crouched over it for a long moment in a way the recording could not fully interpret. Then he did something that made Overseer Simral lean forward against the gallery glass. He took out the log. No one had known he was keeping one. He carried, folded into a waterproof pouch at the small of his back, a set of dense handwritten pages, a survey kept into compact frontier shorthand the translator struggled with, begun, the timestamps made clear, in the first hour of the descent, and added to at every major point since. gas trap at 180, the location and the read on it, the silt drifter encounter, and beside it, a note the biologists would argue about for a cycle, because it was a correct and unassisted deduction about how the species hunted that the Institute's own literature had only reached after 80 years of study. The rock burst, the fault it had opened, and a rough projection, drawn in Rourke's own hand, of where that new fault was going to take the deep well over the next several cycles, and now on the shelf in the deep chamber a final entry. The found gear, the shelf's position, and a short line the translator rendered after some difficulty as poor bastard came down heavy. He put the log away. He did not take the dead candidate's gear. He left it where it was, on the shelf, in the light, and he turned back toward the drowned throats with the core on his harness, and the line waiting in the dark to lead him home, and he began, at the 23rd hour, the ascent that the well reserved most of its dead for. The tidal surge came early. It should not have. The clock the Institute ran was built on the tidal cycle, and the tidal cycle was the most predictable thing about the well, and the deadline had been set with a margin. But the rock burst at the 11th hour had opened a new fault, the fault Rourke had drawn in his log, and the new fault had changed slightly how the water moved through the deep galleries, and the surge that came at the 26th hour came harder and sooner than 300 years of Institute records said it should. The monitoring team caught it in the sensors 2 minutes before it reached him. There was no way to warn him. He had declined the net. He did not need the warning. He was already climbing. The recording of the ascent was the segment Overseer Semrall would watch most often in the cycles that followed, and it was, by any measure the Institute knew how to apply, the finest single piece of survival work in the assessment's history. Rourke felt the surge coming the way he had felt the rock burst coming. In the water, in the way the drowned well began to breathe differently around him. The great slow inhalation of a body of water about to be pulled upward by a giant 100,000 kilometers away. And he did not fight it. Every dead candidate the well had ever taken on the ascent had fought it, had tried to outswim or outpower the surge to the surface, and had lost because the surge was the moon, and the moon does not lose. Rourke read the pulse of it, the rhythm of rise and slack, and he timed himself to it. He climbed hard through the slack water, and he anchored himself, on his own line, at his own preset points, through the push, and he let the surge that killed everyone else lift him, riding the rise where he could, holding fast where he couldn't, using the enormous upward energy of the thing that was supposed to drown him as the engine of his own escape. He came up out of the last drowned throat into the dry upper well on the crest of the surge, cold to the point that the medical staff were already moving toward the extraction point, and he climbed the last 400 meters of dry rock on legs that should not have carried him. In the dark by feel, with the core on his harness, and the log at the small of his back, and he came out through the surface seal at the 29th hour, and some minutes, walking, at the same unhurried pace the recording had caught him leaving at, a little under the deadline, covered in the silt of a place that had killed better-equipped candidates for 300 years and had not been able to find a way to kill him. Overseer Semrall met him at the seal himself. Rourke stood there for a moment, dripping, steaming faintly in the warm air of the surface hall, and unclipped the core from his harness and held it out. Semrall did not take it at once. There was a healing cut along the human's jaw from somewhere early in the descent, and his hands, the overseer noticed, were the hands of someone who had used them hard for a very long time. And the man himself was regarding the overseer with a calmly tired attention that Semrall had seen before, only in the very old members of his own species, the ones who had stopped needing anyone to be impressed. 2 items, Semrall said. It's what I needed, Rourke said. The record for this assessment is 62 items and a full survey team. Rourke reached to the small of his back and took out the pouch and unfolded the log, the pages soft and swollen with water at the edges, but the compact frontier shorthand still legible, and he held it out alongside the core. I did a survey too, he said. Semrall took the log. He was aware as he opened it, of the gallery above going very quiet, and of the junior assessor Ethu standing off to one side with an expression the overseer recognized as the specific stillness of a young evaluator who has just watched a foundational assumption of their profession fail in front of them and is deciding what to do about it. Semrall read the first entry. Hour 1, the gas trap projected from the chart before Rourke had reached it, with a note in the margin on how he intended to confirm it by sound. He read the silt drifter entry and the deduction beside it. And he was quiet for a moment because the deduction was correct and had cost the Institute 80 years and was here written in one line by a mining laborer from a moon the Assembly had never bothered to name. He read the projection of the new fault. He read "Poor bastard came down heavy," and he understood, reading it, that the human had left a dead man's expensive gear on a shelf a kilometre down because the human had come down for the core and not for the equipment, and had felt no need to prove anything by carrying out the answer that had gotten someone killed. He closed the log. He looked at the human, and he asked the question he found he needed the answer to more than he needed anything else in that moment, more than the core, more than the record. "The overlay," he said, "the net. Everything down there was built to keep you alive, and you turned it off, and I need to understand why a man would do that." Jonah Rourke considered the question with the unhurried attention of someone who had been asked it before, by people who mattered to him, in places where the answer had been the difference between coming home and not. "Because every one of those systems," he said, "tells you what it expects to happen. It reads the rock, it runs the numbers, it paints you a picture of the well, the way the well is supposed to be. And that's fine, right up until the well decides to be something else. Then you're standing there trusting a picture, and the rock is doing something the picture never accounted for, and you don't feel it coming because you've spent your whole life letting the picture feel it for you." He paused, and the pause carried, Summerall thought, the weight of a great many cold years in places where no one had ever built a picture to trust. "I learned a long time ago," Rourke said, "that the rock doesn't care what your instruments expect. It only does what it's actually doing. And the only way to know what it's actually doing is to take off everything that's telling you what it should be doing, and put your hand on it, and listen. Every system down there was teaching me to trust the picture. I already know the picture gets people killed. I trust the rock, and I trust myself to listen to it. That's the whole job." Summerall was quiet for a long moment. Then he did a thing that no overseer of the Deepwell Assessment had done in the recorded history of the office, which was to set down the core and open the log again and turn it toward the human and ask him to explain the ascent, the surge timing, the anchoring, the reading of the water's breath. Because the Institute had lost candidates on that ascent for 300 years, and here was a man who had ridden the thing that killed them up out of the dark, and the Institute needed that written down, needed it taught, needed to understand it before it lost one more candidate to a problem this frontier laborer had apparently solved somewhere in the first hour by the simple act of asking how the water knew when to come up. "The review board meets in 4 cycles, Summerall said. "I would like you to present this, all of it, the drifter deduction, the fault projection, the ascent, and I would like the certification program that trained you, whatever they are doing with humans out there on the frontier, to send us their methodology. Because I have administered this assessment for a long time, and I have never watched anyone do what you did today, and I would very much like to stop being surprised." Jonah Rourke looked at the alien who ran the oldest and deadliest evaluation in the assembly and had just asked a mining town rescue tech to come teach the people who designed it. And something in his tired, level face shifted very slightly toward what might have been, on a less exhausted man, a smile. "Nobody trained me," he said. "The rock trained me. Send them the rock." He clipped his empty harness closed, tucked the log back into the pouch at the small of his back, and walked toward the surface hall exit at the same unhurried pace he had carried down into the well and up out of it. A man built for cold rock and long odds and no margin, leaving behind him a core, a soaked survey. No instrument in the Institute had matched, and an overseer standing at the seal with 300 years of records in his hands, and every one of them quietly and permanently revised. The log sat on the table where Summerall set it. 12 pages, watersoft at the edges, written the shorthand of a place the assembly had never named. 2 items, 340 on the wall, and the deepest survey the well had ever given up. And a man who had gone down dark on purpose, because he already knew which one keeps you alive.